He asked Lin what the matter was. He asked if Lin had trouble finding a team. Lin told the White Divine that he had acquired the tyrant's heart. White Divine, still speaking about how he could recommend people to Lin if needed, suddenly emitted a strange yelp the next moment. He asked Lin to repeat himself. Lin repeated that he had acquired the tyrant's heart. White Divine paused. It had not been long since he assigned the task, White Divine pondered. Rising, he inquired about Lin's whereabouts, to which Lin replied that he was in front of his dormitory. Then White Divine ended the call. The communicator vibrated. Lin obtained a new message. New record set in Tyrant's Desert Dungeon. Awarded 5,000 points, 30 contribution points. Can be claimed only once. Upon seeing the message, Lin allowed himself a slight smile. Indeed, the rewards for large-scale dungeons were quite significant. Such a pity that it could only be obtained once. At the dormitory entrance, Lin encountered White Divine. Before Lin could say anything, White Divine reached out to grasp Lin, and in a blink, both vanished. Using a teleportation stone, White Divine whisked Lin away. Moments later, Lin found himself outside a quaint courtyard. Positioned atop a mountain, it emanated a serene aura, encircled by bamboo groves that carried refreshing zephyrs upon every gentle sway. Now bathed under the night sky, moonlight cascading down. An elderly man was seated in the middle of the courtyard. The elderly man appeared mild and cultivated, garbed in a long robe, exuding the aura of a legendary scholar. Upon laying eyes on him, Lin instinctively bowed in respect. Taking the initiative to speak, he bowed courteously. Manhwa was, like White Divine, a figure renowned throughout the empire. Recognized as one of the mightiest professionals, a divine-level formation array grandmaster. Manhwa nodded with a gentle smile, inviting them to join him for tea. Lin then took out the tyrant's heart. It bore the semblance of an actual heart, somewhat soft to the touch, appearing as though it were a living entity. Manhwa glanced at it, affirming, "Indeed, it is the tyrant's heart." White Divine looked towards Lin, wondering if he really soloed the dungeon. Lin nodded. White Divine exhibited a peculiar expression before inquiring, what was his record? Lin answered candidly, a completion time of around 14 hours. Shocks of astonishment graced the faces of both White Divine and Manhwa. Such speed was astounding. This implied that Lin's individual combat power might even surpass that of a 40-member raid party. Manhwa maintained his composure, showing no particular reaction, saying it was a commendable performance. He then looked at White Divine, reminding him to keep the promises made to Lin. White Divine produced an amulet, tossing it to Lin. Observing the basic cooldown amulet in hand, Lin knew it would hasten his leveling speed. White Divine looked at Lin, asking if he wished to join the Creators Academy sooner. Lin nodded, but acknowledged the substantial gap in the required contribution points. He now had 90 points, yet the Academy entry demanded 1,000. He barely had 1/10 of the requisite amount. White Divine, with gentle persuasion, inquired, asking if he had heard of the UN battlefield. Lin shook his head. White Divine sipped his tea, explaining that the UN battlefield contains numerous treasures and opportunities to earn contribution points. The Academy is also stationed there, offering tasks. Completing them also grants contribution points. In essence, if Lin seeks to amass contribution points quickly, the UN battlefield is the place to be. Lin's eyes glimmered faintly, promptly agreeing to the proposal. White Divine advised Lin to rest first, and following the school opening ceremony, he would take Lin to the UN battlefield. After Lin's departure, Manhwa asked White Divine if it was too soon to send him to such a perilous place. White Divine responded that since Lin could solo large-scale dungeons, and at level 20 was on par with many of those who had undergone their second professional transfer, the earlier, the better. Manhwa, with a stern demeanor, noted that White Divine did not inform Lin that the UN battlefield harbors enemies of the human race and is fraught with many dangers. Upon returning to the dormitory, Lin engaged in battles within the dungeon for over a dozen hours, enduring the scorching sun in the vast desert. Both his body and spirit points were utterly exhausted. He didn't even want to meditate and simply wanted to rest for the night. He had exchanged the basic cooldown amulet from White Divine using the Tyrant's Heart. He also learned about the existence of the Yuan battlefield and understood how to earn contribution points. Lin had figured out what he needed to do next. In the blink of an eye, Lin fell asleep, breathing steadily. Meanwhile, the dungeon hall was still bustling with activity. People were coming and going in large numbers. Accompanied by flashes of light, one after another, players appeared in the dungeon hall. A total of 40 people emerged from the dungeon, appearing in the hall. "I'm back, baby!" With an excited shout, the lead knight's face was flushed with the thrill of excitement and pride. And he wasn't the only one. Everyone on the team shared the same exhilarated expression. The bystanders watched as the 40-man 100-mile squad emerged. The leading knight, seemingly oblivious to the conversations of the passers-by, was brimming with pride all on his own. His gaze swept over the crowd as he proudly announced that they had reduced the clear time of the Tyrant Desert Dungeon to 15 hours and 58 minutes, setting a new record. His companions joined in the cheering. The onlookers simply watched and laughed faintly. "Those idiots! They thought they broke the record," someone said. Suddenly, someone from the 100-mile squad pointed at the screen and said, "Captain, something seems off." The leading knight turned his head to look at the screen. The first thing he saw was the message that the Tyrant's Heart had been dropped. However, they had not obtained the Tyrant's Heart. Just as the question arose in his mind, he saw the rankings. Their team was indeed listed, but not in the first place. They were second. The person ranked first was a level 21 player named Lin. The knight captain shuddered. He thought of the person who had entered the dungeon just before them. A chill ran up his spine straight to his brain. A single person, level 21, 14 hours. "This can't be possible!" The leading knight let out a bizarre scream. He found it hard to believe. Their squad had made thorough preparations, the best profession combinations, the finest equipment, and the best shot caller. They had endured countless hardships to slay the boss, squeezing their clear time under 16 hours. Though they hadn't obtained the Tyrant's Heart, they had after all broken the previous record. This was already a remarkable achievement. Yet all their efforts were suppressed by a single person. The leading knight was in a state of frenzy, unable to accept this reality. The people in the dungeon hall watched them with taunting smiles. Everyone from the 100-mile squad felt a burning shame on their faces. It was truly embarrassing. Some had already lowered their heads in humiliation. The leading knight took a deep breath, calmed himself down, and took one last unwilling look at the screen before leading his squad out of the hall. After sleeping until he naturally woke up, Lin felt great. Once he got out of bed, his spirit points have fully recovered. After eating, Lin activated his teleportation stone and arrived at the dungeon hall. Although White Divine had said that desert fruits were a matter of luck and couldn't be sought after intentionally, Lin still wanted to try his luck. If he could find a desert fruit, he was confident that he could quickly level up the slow curse and skeletal armor skills to their maximum levels. "Are you Lin?" A voice interrupted Lin's thoughts. Lin looked up to see a man staring at him. He didn't recognize the man. The stranger then said, "Senior Mark wants to see you. Come with me." His tone carried an inexplicable arrogance. Lin glanced at him, thinking that this guy seemed a bit off in the head. He walked past him and walked towards the Tyrant dungeon. The man's eyes widened as he watched Lin completely ignore him. The man repeated himself again, saying Senior Mark wants to see Lin. Lin simply glanced at the man. If someone wanted to see him, he should come himself. The man shouted angrily, questioning if Lin knew who Mark was. Lin paid him no mind and proceeded to the Tyrant Desert dungeon entrance, only to find that there were still 9 days left on the cooldown. Resetting the dungeon cooldown and entering would cost 2,500 points. Others noticed Lin's attempt to enter the dungeon and expressed their surprise. There was a buzz of discussion about whether Lin was going to enter the Tyrant Desert again. Many were curious and speculative. Harmony was also among the crowd. Many knew that Harmony was one of the few who could talk to Lin. Some people who had unfinished quests wanted Harmony to ask Lin if he could carry them through the dungeon, promising to pay him with points. Seeing Harmony in a difficult position, those people asserted that they wanted nothing. No equipment, not even materials. All drops would be Lin's only. They just wanted to clear the dungeon. Back at the 100-mile squad, the man conveyed Lin's words to Mark. Mark sat in the academy, frowning. "This guy has quite the attitude," he commented coldly, seemingly concluding that Lin had grown arrogant after soloing the Tyrant Desert dungeon once. He dismissed it as a low-level dungeon, stating that Lin didn't understand the changes that occurred in professions after the second profession transfer. A profession that was strong before the second profession transfer could become extremely weak afterward. He believed inviting Lin to meet him was offering him a chance. If Lin was going to be like this, it seemed he needed to be taught a lesson. Mark's arrogance was well known throughout the academy. The embarrassment the 100-mile squad suffered the previous day had already spread throughout the entire academy by morning, leaving Mark embarrassed to show himself. He harbored significant resentment towards Lin, wishing to regain his reputation. The best way to do that would be to have Lin join under his command. But Lin declined. Inside the academy, he couldn't really make a move on Lin. Even if his grandfather was the dean of the 100-mile squad, it wouldn't save him. But if they were outside in the wilderness, that would be a different story altogether. Inside the dungeon hall, Harmony, accompanied by a group of people, approached Lin. Harmony briefly explained the wishes of these people, and the crowd nodded, pleading with Lin to carry them through the Tyrant Desert dungeon to complete their quest. Lin was somewhat surprised and asked what was the quest they were referring to. Harmony explained that it was a dungeon quest issued by the academy, and if they didn't complete it, they wouldn't be able to join the independent squads. Therefore, they were willing to give up any rewards just to have Lin take them through the dungeon. Lin nodded, mentioning that he was a new student and wasn't familiar with these matters. It was then that everyone realized Lin was actually a new student. The crowd began to express their willingness to pay 1,000 points each. Lin thought it over. After buying the weapon, he didn't have much left, and entering the dungeon himself would cost 2,500 points. If each person paid 1,000 points, he could earn 39,000 in each run. Lin smiled and agreed to carry them, stating the price would be as they suggested, 1,000 points each. However, he had one condition. Upon seeing Lin agreed to carry them, everyone showed a smile, saying that they would listen to whatever Lin said. Lin stated that if they encountered a desert fruit, they were not to compete with him for it. Hearing this, everyone thought of the rare and elusive desert fruit. They didn't really think they would encounter it, so they all nodded in agreement. There were far more than 39 people who wanted Lin to take them through the dungeon, causing a crowd and loud shouting about being chosen. The dungeon hall became noisy until Harmony called for everyone to calm down and form a line. She shouted, "If they disturb and annoy Lin, he might not take any of you with him." Hearing this, everyone immediately started to queue up, forming a neat line under a minute. Lin looked at Harmony gratefully, asking if she had completed her quest. Harmony smiled, saying that she had already finished it. Lin nodded, remembering this favor, and told her that if she had any tasks and quests to do in the future, she could ask him for help any time. Harmony smiled happily, playfully saying that she hoped Lin wouldn't refuse when the time came. 40 players entered the dungeon, and the Tyrant Desert remained the same, sand flying everywhere under the scorching sun. Lin asked everyone to follow him, while a chilling wind, his skeleton army rose from the ground. Although some of the skeletons hadn't fully replenished since the previous losses, it was still substantial. Lin issued a command to search for the desert oasis. Seeing nearly 200 summoned creatures, the group was momentarily stunned, having never witnessed such a large number of summoned creatures before. They soon encountered the first wave of monsters, level 25 desert ghost trees, which were almost instantly killed as they came across them. The skeletal warriors spared no effort in using their skills, and the skeleton mages launched rapid ranged attacks. The monsters were swiftly dealt with, and in just over an hour, they spotted the oasis. Seeing that killing a monster only granted 7,500 experience points, Lin sighed, realizing that leading a group through the dungeon indeed resulted in fewer experience points. However, he took comfort in the significant amount of points he earned, planning to slowly grind by himself later on. The skeletal warriors collectively charged toward the oasis. As expected, they were met by a large group of giant desert scorpions. However, the skeletal warriors didn't engage them in combat. Instead, they kited the giant desert scorpions along the water channels of the oasis, running forward. The skeletal warriors controlled their speed to roughly match that of the desert scorpions. The mob chasing them grew larger and larger as more desert scorpions joined the pursuit. The onlookers realized that Lin was kiting the monsters, leading hundreds of them toward the skeletal mages. Just as everyone thought the skeletal mages would use an AoE skill to kill the monsters, they saw a skeletal warrior kill the first desert scorpion. Lin then raised his hand, and with a loud boom, an explosion resonated. Sand flew everywhere once again. Lin had used the skill Corpse Explosion. Continuously casting the Corpse Explosion skill, Lin did not stop even when the desert scorpions were all eliminated. The people watched their experience points increase rapidly, feeling a mix of envy and fear towards Lin's powerful ability. Lin asked them to wait at the current location while he headed towards the ant cave and finished the monsters by himself. The group, left behind, stared at Lin's retreating figure. The group realized that they had progressed this far in just 3 hours. They found it hard to believe their efficiency, and it would probably be unbelievable if they hadn't witnessed it with their own eyes. 20 minutes later, the group sat under the shade of palm trees, enjoying the cool area. One person suggested to a few friends that they should try pulling a monster themselves. Seeing how easily Lin dealt with them, they assumed the creatures here couldn't be that challenging. A few of them nodded in agreement, curious to try it out for themselves. After all, their levels were even higher than Lin's. Surely they could handle one monster. However, 2 minutes later, one of the guys accidentally pulled 2 desert scorpions at once. The tank raised his shield, preparing to take the aggro, and ordered the healer to start healing. But the group started to panic, realizing the monsters might be more than they could handle. The others watched as 2 giant desert scorpions charged towards them. Instead of watching the group and laughing at them, all of them quickly grabbed their weapons, ready to join the fight. The tanks positioned themselves at the front, adopting defensive stances. One of the scorpions rammed into a tank, nearly depleting his health bar in a single hit, leaving the group in disbelief at the strength of its attack. The healers frantically cast healing spells to keep everyone alive. Mages and melee DPS started their assault, but their combined efforts seemed to barely scratch the scorpion, making it seem like they were just tickling the beast. After a few minutes of relentless attacking, the health bar of the scorpion had hardly decreased. The DPS at the front line were running low on health, so another group took over the front lines. After an intense battle, they finally managed to take down one of the desert scorpions. Panting and exhausted, they could hardly believe how difficult the monsters in this area were. They realized just how strong Lin truly was. Watching the system prompts, Lin shook his head with a smile. These people really couldn't stay put. Seeing that some of them had actually taken a seat, a tank yelled out, reminding them that there was still another scorpion to deal with. They then remembered that there were 2 scorpions, but by now their health and mana bars were nearly depleted, and they were extremely tired. They regretted not listening to Lin and staying put. Just as the remaining desert scorpion broke through the tanks and charged towards the backline, skeletal warriors suddenly flew down from the sky. The skeletal warriors used a rampage strike, instantly killing the desert scorpion. The group, which had struggled for so long against one scorpion, watched in awe as a single skeletal warrior effortlessly took down the other. Fortunately, Lin had left a skeletal warrior to protect the team. Another 20 minutes had passed, and some members of the group were wondering why Lin hadn't killed any monsters yet. Another person speculated that he must be pulling mobs just like before. Soon after, the group saw a flood of system notifications. While they were still outside discussing how difficult it must be to fight the exceptionally strong Queen Ant boss inside the ant cave, Lin had already used Corpse Explosion to instantly kill the Queen Ant. Everyone received a notification for defeating the level 28 Desert Queen Ant. Lin then returned to the group, instructing everyone to prepare to head straight to the tyrant's castle. He planned to quickly clear the dungeon to reset it and search for the desert fruit. As they approached the towering castle with its solid gates and hundreds of Lion Tribe soldiers, Lin didn't waste any time figuring out how to quickly open the castle gates using some specific mechs. Instead, he opted for a more straightforward and brutal approach. After all, if you can out-DPS the enemy, why bother with mechanics? Watching Lin pile up the bodies of hundreds of Lion Tribe warriors at the castle gate and then use corpse explosion, the group realized for the first time that such a tactic was even possible. They progressed through the dungeon until they reached the throne of the desert tyrant. A single roar from the tyrant made everyone tremble. They were ready to retreat even further, but the tyrant looked down at Lin, his eyes filled with mockery and disdain. Lin simply smiled and said, "We meet again, but I'm in a hurry this time." With a wave of his hand, an army of skeletons charged at the tyrant. Lin gave the command to eliminate the tyrant while casting a slow curse on the tyrant. He continuously used Soul Flame to interrupt the tyrant's skills, making the powerful boss seem like a mere toy in front of Lin. One of the team members even considered joining the fight, but his friend mockingly said, "Go ahead, just don't wet your pants." While they were joking, a system notification appeared. Level 31 Tyrant defeated. The group watched as they cleared the dungeon. Some even shed tears, overwhelmed with relief and joy. They had been stuck on this quest for 1 or 2 years, and now they had finally completed it. They shouted Lin's name in gratitude and admiration, thanking him for his help before being teleported out of the dungeon. Leaving the dungeon through the exit, Lin found himself once again surrounded by a crowd. He asked Harmony to help organize the next group. Someone noticed Lin coming out of the dungeon and immediately reported back to Mark. Mark instructed him to follow Lin into the dungeon to observe how he cleared it. Inside the dungeon hall, a long queue stretched from the entrance of the Desert Tyrant dungeon all the way outside the hall. Lin was taken aback by the sheer number of people, even more than before. Harmony explained with a smile that these were all players who wanted to clear the dungeon, and they had brought friends along. They had been stuck on this quest for a long time. The team was quickly filled up, and after Lin reiterated the rules, everyone happily agreed. Moments later, Lin led a group of 39 players into the dungeon once again. This time, luck was on Lin's side. He found the desert fruit. With about a day and a half left until the opening ceremony of the academy, Lin planned to clear the dungeon as many times as possible to quickly wrap more points. The team quickly encountered the first group of monsters, and just like the previous groups, they were astonished by Lin's abilities. Soon they reached the boss, and this time it only took them 7 hours, which has shattered the previous record. Everyone happily teleported out of the dungeon, except for one person who thought to himself that this was terrifying and that he needed to report back to Mark as soon as possible. Back at 100 Mile Squad, Mark received the report. "So, he's using area of effect skills that take advantage of corpses," he mused, "and he has an exceptionally strong skeleton army. That means if we restrict his summoning spells and make sure there are no corpses around, Lin would be easy to deal with." Mark smirked, thinking every class has its weaknesses, and Lin's weakness is right here. Mark analyzed Lin's skill set with a vengeful look in his eyes. Lin had not only humiliated him, but had also tarnished the reputation of the 100 Mile Squad. Without Lin, the new record should have belonged to the 100 Mile Squad, and they might have even obtained the Tyrant Heart. After pondering for a moment, Mark said to his subordinate, telling him to bring Jacob from the Hidden Dragon Squad to him. Tell Jacob that there's something he wants to discuss. In his heart, Mark was determined to make Lin pay. Not long after, Jacob arrived to meet with Mark. At Xiajing Academy, in a 2-person dormitory room, Charlotte looked out of the window. Unlike Lin, she couldn't afford the luxury of a single room and chose a 2-person room instead. As an elemental mage, she needed a quiet environment for meditation. A 4-person dormitory would be too noisy, but a single room was too expensive. She weighed her options, and chose the two-person room. Her father had repeatedly reminded her to be frugal with her points, and to use gold coins wherever possible, making her realize how hard it was to earn points. Charlotte envied Lynn for having over 30,000 points right after completing the exam. She wondered how many points Lynn would have after being titled the national top scholar would receive, but it certainly wouldn't be a small amount. She had heard from Principal Liu that Lynn had already arrived at Xiajing Academy a few days ago. She didn't know how he was doing lately, but she smiled to herself, thinking that with his abilities, Lynn should be doing quite well. Lynn continued to lead a new group through the dungeon, defeating the Lion Tribe tyrant over and over again, and consuming the desert fruit to constantly upgrade his skills. Meanwhile, in White Divine's small courtyard, 3 people were sitting. An old man was angry and sternly speaking to White Divine, telling him, "That young man White Divine mentioned earlier is causing too much trouble." White Divine showed a puzzled expression. Lin's personality was quite calm. How could he cause any trouble? Meng Anwen was also here. He poured a cup of tea for Ning Tairan, urging him to calm down and take his time to explain. This old man, Ning Tairan, is Ning Yiyi's grandfather, and also the principal of Xiajing Academy. Ning Tairan turned on the surveillance to show what happened in the dungeon hall, explaining that Lin had the audacity to charge people points to carry and bus them through the Tyrant Desert dungeon. White Divine didn't feel Lin did anything wrong, as charging people to carry them to dungeons was a common practice known as busing. However, Ning Tairan, discontented, looked at White Divine and said, "But Lin took 39 people in a single run all by himself, and most of the people he carried had been stuck on this task for years." White Divine burst into laughter upon hearing this. He didn't care about the rest of Ning Tairan's words. The fact that Lin took 39 people with him was just too interesting. He even slapped his thigh, lamenting that he didn't think of doing this back in his day. But then he realized that he probably couldn't have cleared it alone either. Smiling, he asked Ning Tairan, "How much did Lin charge? He better not have gone easy on them." Ning Tairan, eyes wide open in anger, slammed his hand on the stone table, almost shattering White Divine's table. He angrily looked at White Divine, questioning if he really did not understand the purpose of the Academy setting up these tasks. These tasks given by the Academy, especially for the large-scale dungeons, are meant to select outstanding talents. Those who are stuck on these dungeon tasks usually have some flaws. White Divine, sipping his tea, spoke indifferently. He was well aware of this. What Lin did was align with the rules of the Academy, since there are no rules prohibiting people from getting carried. He looked at Ning Tairan and asked, "Which rule did Lin violate?" White Divine put down his teacup and spoke earnestly, expressing his long-standing dissatisfaction with these tasks. He recalled the promising youngsters over the years who, due to their introverted personalities or lack of social skills, couldn't find a party and got stuck, wasting months or even years of their time on these tasks. Not just White Divine, but most of the officials of the academies were aware of this issue. White Divine believed that Lin had done a great deed, and that it was time to change the outdated systems of the Academy. Meng Anwen also took a sip of tea and agreed with White Divine, thinking that the Academy's system was too old-fashioned. A system from hundreds of years ago needed some reforms. Ning Tairan was so angry that he was practically steaming. He suddenly stood up. White Divine, however, continued to laugh and reminded me that Ning Tairan shouldn't act so firmly at his age. He looked at Ning Tairan with a seemingly casual yet somewhat threatening demeanor. He calmly stated, "If Ning Tairan dares to lay a finger on Lin, he will personally tear down the dungeon hall." Upon hearing this, the corners of Ning Tairan's mouth twitched. He knew that White Divine was someone who would indeed carry out his threats. With that, Ning Tairan left in a huff. Meng Anwen chuckled and commented, "Old Ning's temper really is something that can't be changed." White Divine, unfazed, smiled as he watched Ning Tairan's retreating figure. "That's the old Ning we known for years, after all. As for old Ning, there's only one person in the whole world who can handle him." Meng Anwen smiled and knew exactly who White Divine was referring to. Meanwhile, in the Tyrant Desert, Lin almost lost count, but Lin entered the Tyrant Desert once again, arriving at the familiar desert oasis. He was quite lucky, as he encountered desert fruits a few times. Using these fruits, He managed to upgrade his skeletal armor to level 21. Now, the skeletal armor could provide Lin with 2100 points in both vitality and defense.